A monster officially declared dead years ago crawled from the dark and spoke the name Kang Seo-jin. Hours earlier, that same boy had been disposable cargo to the team that abandoned him underground. Nobody at Haeryeong Academy expected a salvager to survive where trained combat hunters were already retreating. Seo-jin had spent most of his life learning what people discarded after taking everything they considered valuable. That habit would become the only reason he lived. In Haeryeong, awakened professions decided almost everything before a student ever entered a real dungeon. Sword classes filled the central halls, mage lectures occupied the polished towers, and healer candidates received private sponsors. Salvagers studied behind the supply wing beside crates that smelled of antiseptic, monster oil, and old leather. Their work began after the fighting ended. They cut usable glands from corpses, separated poison tissue, identified salvageable bones, and packed materials for licensed workshops. A competent salvager could save a guild money. That was the highest praise the profession usually received. Nobody advertised dungeon raids with a salvager standing at the front. Nobody expected one to stop a charging beast or survive a boss room alone. Kang Seo-jin knew those expectations better than anyone. His academy uniform had been repaired so many times that the original stitching had nearly disappeared. He cleaned his boots instead of replacing them and sharpened used extraction knives until their handles turned smooth. Every meal ticket mattered because his scholarship covered tuition, not the quiet expenses surrounding it. A broken tool could erase a week of food. A failed field assessment could erase his place at Haeryeong entirely. That pressure followed him into every lecture hall. Combat students crossed the aisle rather than share a table cluttered with specimen jars and stained gloves. Some called salvagers corpse pickers when instructors could not hear them. Seo-jin rarely answered. Every insult mattered less than the monster anatomy he was quietly memorizing. He kept recording extraction angles, tissue colors, shell density, and the small differences other students dismissed as useless trivia. Monster bodies told stories if someone bothered to read them carefully. A torn tendon showed how the creature had pivoted before death. A cracked fang revealed where armor had stopped its bite. Burn patterns across a hide exposed the direction a spell had struck. Seo-jin understood monsters best after they stopped moving. He hated that limitation because all his knowledge became useful only after someone else finished the dangerous part. During practical combat, his profession offered no burst skill, no reinforced body, and no glowing weapon technique. His first profession skill was Carcass Appraisal. It could identify usable monster materials with frightening precision. Against a living target, it did nothing. His second skill, Clean Extraction, protected valuable tissues from damage while he separated them from a corpse. It reduced damage to harvested materials and helped him separate valuable parts without ruining their properties. Again, the Academy ranking board gave him almost no credit. Haeryeong rewarded whatever kept a hunter alive during battle. Seo-jin specialized in what remained after someone stronger had already won. Even so, he refused to become careless. He trained his grip with weighted tools after class and studied monster anatomy past midnight. He mapped weak joints from autopsy diagrams and memorized which organs stored mana under different conditions. None of that made him impressive during sparring. It did make him difficult to surprise. On the morning of his first licensed academy dungeon, Seo-jin arrived before the combat team finished checking their weapons. The assigned gate stood beneath an abandoned reservoir outside Haeryeong City. Cold vapor rolled from the entrance and gathered around the concrete steps. The dungeon had been classified for trainees under supervision. Its recorded monsters were tunnel hounds, moss crawlers, and one armored burrower guarding the deepest chamber. None of those creatures were considered unusual. The students treated the trip as an easy chance to improve their field evaluations. Seo-jin treated it as a chance to earn material credits. The team leader barely looked at him during the briefing. Seo-jin was told to stay behind the fighters, collect only marked remains, and avoid slowing the formation. The instructions left no room for pride. He checked his extraction case anyway, because those battered tools were the only equipment his profession truly depended on. 2 narrow knives, sealable specimen cloth, mana-resistant thread, bone shears, and a battered utility hammer sat inside. None of it looked heroic, yet every piece had earned its place through months of academy salvage work. Every piece had kept him fed during academy work assignments. The team entered the dungeon shortly after the gate stabilized. Damp stone swallowed the daylight within a few steps. Blue guide crystals embedded in the walls marked the approved route toward the training zone. The first tunnel hounds attacked near a collapsed support arch. Steel flashed before Seo-jin could move forward. The front lane crushed the pack quickly, leaving torn hides and steaming black claws across the floor. While the fighters checked their experience gains, Seo-jin knelt among the remains. He worked quickly, following the familiar sequence of cut, isolate, seal, and label before the remains cooled. One claw had absorbed enough earth mana to harden naturally during impact. The others had shattered because the hounds struck the shields at poor angles. Seo-jin separated the intact claw and wrapped it carefully. Nobody asked why he kept the claw, since the fighters had already dismissed the entire corpse as worthless. The next chamber held moss crawlers clinging beneath a stone bridge. Fire magic drove them down in burning clusters. Their bodies collapsed into wet fibers that combat students stepped over without slowing. Seo-jin stopped for 3 breaths beside the largest remains. Carcass Appraisal highlighted a pale knot beneath the creature's central mass. The tissue was worthless on the market unless removed before the residual mana dispersed. Seo-jin cut it free and sealed it. The team leader clicked his tongue from the bridge. Seo-jin packed the sample and hurried after them. Several students laughed about how much trouble he took for scraps. Seo-jin let them laugh because scraps were precisely the resources nobody stronger ever bothered to contest. Scraps were the only resources nobody fought him for. Deeper inside, the dungeon stopped matching the academy map. The first warning appeared on the walls. Guide crystals that should have glowed blue had darkened from the center outward. The second warning came from the floor. Fresh claw marks crossed an older route marker at shoulder height. Tunnel hounds could not reach that high while standing normally. Seo-jin touched the grooves with one gloved finger. Fresh stone dust still clung inside the grooves, proving whatever carved them had passed through recently. Seo-jin memorized the grooves before moving on, because fresh damage inside a map dungeon rarely meant anything harmless. The team leader dismissed the concern because the gate rating had not changed. Seo-jin looked toward the tunnel ahead and tightened the strap on his extraction case. A low vibration traveled through the soles of his boots. The vibration returned harder, strong enough to rattle loose grit across the bridge beneath their boots. Dust streamed from the ceiling, and even the loudest students began watching the cracks above them. The fighters stopped joking as a deeper impact rolled through the stone beneath their formation. Something massive was moving below, and its weight made the entire bridge answer with another tremor. The floor broke before the formation could retreat. Stone dropped into a black shaft while a segmented creature burst upward through the collapsing passage. Its plated head filled half the tunnel. Jagged mineral growths covered its shell where the dungeon record showed smooth armor. The supposed training boss had changed beyond the academy record, and its mineral armor kept thickening around the core. The first charge threw 2 shield users into the wall. Their formation broke immediately, leaving the front line exposed before anyone could rebuild the defensive spacing. A mage released a fire lance at the exposed mouth. The spell struck, spread across the mineral plates, and vanished into glowing cracks without slowing the creature. Seo-jin saw the problem before the others did. The shell was storing heat, and every fire spell made the red mineral veins burn brighter beneath it. Every red vein across the armor brightened with each fire spell. The next attack would feed it again. Seo-jin shouted for the mage to stop casting fire. The team leader heard him and chose to attack anyway. Another fire lance struck the plated neck, feeding the same glowing veins Seo-jin had already warned them about. The burrower answered by driving its body through the bridge supports. The chamber tilted under a roar of breaking stone. Students scrambled toward the marked exit tunnel. Seo-jin ran with them until the rear passage folded inward. A slab struck his shoulder and sent him across the floor. His extraction case tore open on impact, scattering the tools he depended on across the collapsing floor. Knives, thread, cloth, and sealed samples scattered through the dust. Seo-jin forced himself onto one knee while the rest of the team crowded toward the escape corridor. The others were already beyond the widest fracture, close enough to the escape passage that none needed Seo-jin to survive. He could see them through the falling debris. One student looked back at Seo-jin, hesitating long enough for the team leader to seize his arm. The student stumbled toward the corridor as the team leader dragged him away from the broken floor. Nobody crossed the broken floor for Seo-jin. Nobody needed to say the decision aloud. Every pair of boots kept moving toward the exit. The choice lasted less than a second, yet it told Seo-jin exactly how much his life weighed to them. A support pillar crashed between Seo-jin and the others, sealing that decision behind a wall of stone. The corridor vanished behind stone and gray dust. Seo-jin heard boots receding on the other side. He stared at the blocked passage until another tremor shook grit from his hair. The dungeon had entered collapse, and the emergency crystals were already flashing faster along the fractured walls. Blue warning flashes shortened toward red, signaling that the gate's structural stability was failing by the second. Their pulse grew faster each time the ceiling shifted. Seo-jin checked his left arm first, testing whether the impact had damaged bone, tendon, or joint movement. His fingers still moved, though lifting the arm sent a hard line of pain through his shoulder. His shoulder burned when he raised it, but the joint still held. He gathered the nearest tools before the floor moved again. The utility hammer had survived, giving Seo-jin one blunt weapon and one reliable tool for whatever waited deeper inside. One extraction knife had broken completely, and every remaining second inside the gate still mattered. His specimen cloth was half buried beneath rubble. Seo-jin pulled it free with his good hand. The intact tunnel hound claw remained wrapped inside. So did the moss crawler core tissue. The team had abandoned him with materials they considered worthless. Seo-jin had no weapon better than a hammer. He also had no marked route back. The remaining tunnel behind him descended away from the collapse. Red emergency light rolled across the stone in broken pulses. Staying beneath the damaged chamber would bury him. Going deeper might do the same thing more slowly. Seo-jin chose movement because staying beside the blocked corridor would only let the collapsing dungeon choose for him. He wrapped his shoulder with mana-resistant thread and used cloth to keep pressure against the bruise. Then he picked up the hammer and entered the unmarked tunnel. Every step carried him farther from the official route. The vibration followed beneath the floor, pulsing through each turn as Seo-jin moved farther from the academy route. He found the first abandoned supply alcove after several turns. Empty potion bottles lay beneath broken shelving. A torn academy seal showed that another training team had used the chamber long ago. Seo-jin searched the floor instead of the shelves. Salvagers learned where rushed hunters failed to look. A strip of dried crawler membrane had hardened inside a drainage crack. Carcass Appraisal marked it as man-absorbent. Seo-jin cut it into strips and wrapped them around the hammer grip. The modification looked crude, but the membrane stopped the hammer from sliding inside his sweat-slick palm. It stopped the tool from slipping in his sweating hand. A scratching sound came from the next passage. Seo-jin lowered his stance beside the wall. A wounded tunnel hound limped into the red light. One foreleg dragged uselessly behind the hound, exposing exactly the kind of weakness Seo-jin understood. The creature smelled him and bared cracked teeth. Seo-jin had never killed a dungeon monster alone. He had opened hundreds of their bodies afterward. That difference became Seo-jin's only advantage. The living monster still obeyed the anatomy he had studied on corpses. He watched the hound shift weight toward its healthy side. Its damaged foreleg exposed the soft seam behind the shoulder plate. Seo-jin stepped inside the bite instead of backing away. Teeth snapped beside his sleeve as Seo-jin crossed the hound's biting range before it could correct its balance. The hammer drove into the exposed joint. The hound slammed into the wall with its damaged joint folded beneath it, giving Seo-jin another opening. Seo-jin struck the same exposed joint again before the creature could shift its weight back to the healthy side. The hound collapsed and stopped moving, leaving Seo-jin alone with the first monster he had ever killed himself. His hands shook badly enough to rattle the hammer head against stone after the fight ended. He crouched until his breathing steadied enough to hold a knife. Once the danger stopped moving, Seo-jin fell back on the work his body already knew by repetition. Carcass Appraisal spread pale markings across the body. The damaged foreleg offered little value, so Seo-jin ignored it and followed the appraisal marks toward healthier tissue. The jaw muscles remained intact enough to harvest without wasting time on the damaged foreleg. One sensory gland behind the ear still held concentrated mana. Seo-jin removed the gland cleanly and sealed it before its residual mana could leak away. Carcass Appraisal marked the gland as usable, so Seo-jin wrapped it separately from the damaged materials. A deeper tremor interrupted the work before he could inspect the hound any further. Dust spilled from the ceiling and drifted toward the passage ahead instead of settling. Seo-jin watched the movement and understood that air was being pulled somewhere deeper underground. With the blocked academy route behind him, that current offered the only direction that might still lead outside. He packed the gland, tightened the cloth around his shoulder, and followed the moving dust. The tunnel narrowed until exposed mineral roots pressed through both walls around him. Thin red veins pulsed inside those roots with the same color as the mutated training boss. Seo-jin stopped before touching them and brought the sealed hound gland closer. The residual mana inside the gland warmed against the specimen cloth as the mineral veins brightened. That reaction warned Seo-jin that the lower dungeon was altering monster materials through the red mineral growths. He stored the gland again before the resonance could grow any stronger. Every few steps, the emergency tremors shook more grit loose behind him. The collapse was closing roots faster than Seo-jin could map them. He kept moving until the narrow passage opened into a forgotten storage chamber. Old expedition crates sagged against the walls beneath layers of mineral dust. Rusted clasps hung open, and several lids had already been broken away. Someone had searched this chamber long before Seo-jin reached it. Empty potion racks, torn coin sleeves, and stripped weapon cases showed how thoroughly they had worked. A combat hunter would have turned around after one glance at the emptied shelves. Seo-jin started checking the parts nobody would normally bother touching. He lifted broken boards, searched beneath rotten packing straw, and inspected abandoned monster restraints. Most of what he found had already decayed beyond any practical use. One cracked mana bottle still held residue, though Carcass Appraisal judged it too unstable to collect. A rusted restraint buckle contained trace beast mana, but the corrosion had destroyed its structure. Seo-jin discarded both and continued toward the darkest corner of the room. A collapsed restraint frame there had sunk halfway into the dust. Carcass Appraisal flickered when Seo-jin passed his hand across the metal. The skill normally reacted only to monster remains and materials derived directly from them. Seo-jin crouched and checked the floor beneath the frame instead of trusting the first reading. A dull bronze reflection showed through the dust under one bent support bar. He wedged the utility hammer beneath the frame and forced the weight upward. Pain pulled across his shoulder, but the frame shifted enough for him to drag it aside. A small bronze chest had been hidden underneath it. The lid was scratched, dented, and coated with the same dust as the surrounding crates. Its lock had already been broken years earlier. A faded inventory tag still clung to one hinge. The old tag marked the container as cleared and stripped of valuables. Seo-jin opened the lid with his hammer raised beside his face. Only dust and a torn inner lining waited inside. Whoever searched the chamber before him had already taken everything worth noticing. Seo-jin nearly closed the lid until Carcass Appraisal flickered across the torn lining again. He ran one gloved finger along the seam where the cloth had separated from the bronze wall. Dark residue had hardened inside the narrow gap beneath the lining. It looked like dried mud mixed with old ash. Carcass Appraisal failed to identify the substance, yet the skill continued marking the same hidden seam. Seo-jin cut the rotten lining away with his remaining extraction knife. A thin bronze fragment lay pressed beneath it, shaped like one scale broken from something larger. The fragment carried no academy rune or guild registration mark. A closed eye symbol had been carved into one side so faintly that dust almost concealed it. Seo-jin touched the fragment with the tip of his glove. Bronze light climbed across his fingers before he could pull his hand back. The chest answered with a low metallic pulse that traveled through the entire chamber. Seo-jin stepped away, but the fragment remained fixed against his palm. A new interface unfolded across his vision in branching bronze lines. Its shape matched neither Haeryeong Academy status window nor any guild-issued hunter interface. The first line identified the fragment as an activation anchor awaiting a compatible profession. A second line scanned Seo-jin's Salvager class and accepted the match. The bronze fragment warmed sharply, and the interface expanded around a single unfamiliar system name. Critical Replication System awakened the instant the chest accepted Seo-jin's Salvager class. Seo-jin read the name twice while the broken chest continued pulsing beneath his hand. The system displayed one primary rule before revealing anything else. Successfully salvaged resources from creatures stronger than Seo-jin could trigger a critical replication event. A larger difference in strength increased the possible number and quality of replicated materials. The interface offered no attack skill, body enhancement, or replacement combat class. Every function on the screen depended on the salvager profession he had been mocked for awakening. Seo-jin remembered the sensory gland sealed inside his specimen cloth. The system marked that recently harvested gland as an eligible resource. He removed it carefully and placed it inside the open bronze chest. Bronze lines spread beneath the gland, tracing its shape without damaging the remaining mana. The system registered the material as salvage taken from a creature stronger than its current user. A replication check began before Seo-jin could decide whether the result was worth risking. The single gland trembled once against the bronze floor. Then several identical glands appeared around it with the same density and residual mana. Seo-jin stared until Carcass Appraisal confirmed every copy as genuine monster material. One wounded tunnel hound had produced more usable resources than an entire academy training assignment. For the first time, taking scraps from stronger hunters' battlefields could become a path instead of a dead end. Another bronze line appeared beneath the successful replication result. The new entry carried the name Echo Det and a small circular mark beside it. One dark segment filled inside that circle without any explanation. Seo-jin tried opening the entry, but the interface returned only bronze static. No cost, limit, or condition appeared behind the unfamiliar value. The system had multiplied a real resource, yet it had recorded some hidden payment at the same moment. Seo-jin sealed the replicated glands instead of testing the function again immediately. Survival still mattered more than learning every rule inside a collapsing dungeon. When he lifted the bronze fragment, the empty chest responded with another short pulse. The system identified the chest as the anchor that had completed its activation. 2 additional salvager functions unlocked after the anchor stabilized. The first allowed replicated monster materials to preserve compatible traits from their original source. The second allowed compatible resources to be combined through profession-assisted processing. A third function remained sealed behind the same bronze static covering Echo Det. Seo-jin slipped the bronze scale inside his uniform where it could not fall from a torn pocket. The instant the fragment touched his chest, every remaining lamp in the storage room went dark. A wet clicking sound answered from the passage he had just crossed. Seo-jin raised the hammer and turned toward the doorway as several shapes scraped across the stone. 3 moss crawlers squeezed into the chamber, their bodies threaded with the same unnatural red mineral. The red mineral threads beneath the crawlers glowed brightly enough to reveal their bodies in the darkness. Each creature was thicker and faster than the moss crawlers assigned to Haeryeong's beginner route. The first crawler launched from the wall before Seo-jin could retreat toward the chest. Seo-jin raised the utility hammer with both hands and braced his injured shoulder behind the handle. The impact numbed his wrists, but the improvised membrane grip kept the hammer from twisting free. Instead of matching its strength, Seo-jin redirected the crawler into a rotten expedition crate. The crate burst apart and exposed the pulsing core knot beneath the creature's tangled fibers. Seo-jin stepped through the splinters and drove the hammer straight into that exposed knot. Moss fibers cinched around the hammer head and tried to drag the weapon from his hands. The membrane wrapped around the grip held long enough for Seo-jin to wrench the hammer loose. He recovered the weapon just as the second crawler swept low across the floor. Seo-jin kicked a loose restraint frame into its path instead of meeting the charge directly. The crawler tangled itself in the metal bars and tore several fibers trying to escape. Seo-jin crossed the distance before it could free its core. 2 hammer strikes crushed the central knot and dropped the creature inside the broken frame. The third crawler fell from the ceiling behind Seo-jin before he could turn fully. Its fibers coiled around his injured shoulder and tightened against the bruised joint. Pain shot down his arm hard enough to loosen his grip on the hammer. Seo-jin drove himself backward into the wall, using his own weight to trap the crawler. The creature flattened against the stone and exposed the softer underside beneath its core fibers. Seo-jin stabbed upward with his remaining extraction knife while keeping the crawler pinned behind him. The blade pierced the exposed tissue and snapped near the handle under the strain. The crawler sagged against his back as the remaining fibers lost their grip. Seo-jin pulled himself free and stood among 3 corpses, shattered crates, and scattered restraint bars. His last proper extraction knife had broken, leaving the utility hammer and snapped blade as his only tools. 3 monsters stronger than him now lay within reach of the profession everyone considered worthless. For a salvager, the fight had only opened the most valuable part of the encounter. Carcass Appraisal marked dense core fibers, mineral-fed membranes, and 1 intact resonance sac inside each body. Seo-jin harvested the first resonance sac carefully with the shortened blade. The Critical Replication System reacted the moment the organ separated cleanly from the corpse. Bronze light crossed the sac, and several identical organs appeared beside the original on his specimen cloth. Echo Deb gained another dark segment at the same instant, still refusing to reveal what the increase meant. Seo-jin studied the result long enough to confirm the copies before returning to the remaining corpses. Those replicated sacs alone could replace several complete extraction kits once he escaped the dungeon. The second crawler yielded another intact sac, yet the replication check ended without producing a copy. The third crawler produced only 1 additional membrane when its own replication event triggered. The uneven results showed that the system multiplied opportunity, rather than guaranteeing the same reward every time. Seo-jin could improve his odds by targeting stronger sources, but he could never command the exact outcome. That uncertainty made every successful salvage valuable and every unnecessary risk dangerous. As Seo-jin grew stronger, weaker monsters would naturally become poorer sources for critical replication. Stronger monsters, however, could turn materials abandoned by other hunters into resources far beyond normal salvage value. That rule matched Salvager better than any combat class Seo-jin could imagine. He never needed ownership of the first strike to benefit from a defeated monster. Guild rankings and flashy finishing attacks mattered less than access to remains everyone else had already discarded. For the first time, Seo-jin could see a progression path built around his profession instead of despite it. Every corpse became a chain of possible materials rather than a single market price. A discarded organ could become several copies if the source had been strong enough. A broken shell could still carry 1 trait worth combining with another salvaged part. Seo-jin packed the usable materials until his damaged specimen case could barely close. He reinforced the torn latch with monster thread before checking the remains of his broken knife. The metal edge was ruined, but the grip and short section near the handle remained intact. Seo-jin placed the tunnel hound's hardened claw beside the damaged knife and opened the processing interface. The system marked both pieces as compatible with a simple salvager-assisted reinforcement method. Seo-jin chose the lowest risk option because he could not afford to destroy his remaining cutting tool. Bronze lines wrapped around the claw and broken steel without producing heat or sparks. The claw softened along its inner edge and folded around the surviving metal. When the light faded, a dark hooked cutting surface had replaced the snapped portion of the blade. The finished claw knife looked crude, but its point carried the hound's natural piercing strength. Carcass Appraisal confirmed the new edge could cut monster cartilage more efficiently than the Academy knife had. Seo-jin tested it on crawler membrane and watched the hooked edge pass through without snagging. That clean cut changed what salvager could mean inside a dungeon. His profession knowledge now supported equipment creation as well as harvesting after combat. Seo-jin turned the rough claw knife in his hand, measuring its balance against his tired wrist. Haeryeong had trained him to clean up after stronger hunters finished fighting. The system gave him a way to use those remains before the next fight even began. A deeper tremor rolled beneath the chamber and shook dust from the empty shelves. The bronze chest shifted against the floor as the same vibration passed through its open lid. Seo-jin looked inside once more before leaving the chamber behind. A narrow groove had appeared where the activation fragment had rested beneath the torn lining. Dark particles moved through that groove against gravity and gathered around the closed-eye symbol. Echo Det pulsed beside the symbol, linking the unreadable value to the chest for one brief instant. Both signs faded before Seo-jin could force the interface to explain either one. He closed the chest and left it where earlier hunters had already abandoned it. The bronze scale stayed beneath his uniform, warm against the cloth whenever the dungeon trembled. Seo-jin entered a maintenance passage hidden behind the rotten expedition crates. The air current grew stronger there, carrying warm mineral vapor from somewhere below. Red roots covered more of the tunnel walls with every turn Seo-jin descended. Several roots had split from internal pressure, exposing glowing veins beneath their hardened outer layer. Carcass Appraisal finally identified the nearest growth after Seo-jin stopped beside one cracked section. Burrower molt residue had fused with dungeon minerals and spread downward through the old passage. The appraisal showed the residue had been carried through the mineral network, rather than deposited in one isolated spot. Thin pulses of red light moved deeper through the wall each time the dungeon trembled. Seo-jin scraped one loose mineral flake from the cracked edge without cutting into the active vein. The sample retained traces of burrower residue, heat, and unfamiliar corpseborn mana mixed inside the same structure. He sealed the flake separately because the combination might explain how the training boss had mutated. The bronze fragment beneath his uniform warmed when he brought the sample close to his chest. Seo-jin pulled the specimen away before the reaction could strengthen or trigger another unknown system response. The warmth faded immediately, leaving him with a connection he could observe without yet explaining. He resumed following the maintenance route, while the red mineral growths thickened around the passage. The tunnel sloped downward, and warm vapor gathered near the floor in slow-moving layers. Every few steps, another cracked root exposed brighter veins beneath its hardened surface. The air tasted metallic enough that Seo-jin covered his mouth with a strip of specimen cloth. Carcass Appraisal kept marking the growths as mixed monster residue fused into dungeon mineral. The repeated readings confirmed that the contamination extended far beyond the single mutated training boss. Seo-jin followed the strongest mineral pulse, because it ran in the same direction as the descending airflow. The red glow beneath the stone became steadier as the passage narrowed around him. Nothing on Haeryeong's Academy map showed any structure beneath the official boss chamber. Yet the fused residue clearly continued downward into a level the students had never been told existed. Something in that buried level had been feeding altered monster traits back toward the training dungeon above. Seo-jin tightened his grip on the claw knife. The Academy map had never shown anything beneath that chamber. Another scraping sound traveled along the tunnel. This one was smaller than the burrower. It was also coming from several directions. Seo-jin moved toward a side alcove before the first shape appeared. Pale scavenger beetles poured over the stone. Scavenger beetles usually avoided living hunters, which made their approach more disturbing than their numbers alone. Red mineral dust coated their pale shells and glowed faintly whenever they crossed the exposed roots. Every antenna turned toward Seo-jin at once, tracking the monster materials packed inside his specimen case. The entire swarm changed direction together and began flowing toward the alcove where Seo-jin had retreated. Seo-jin backed into the alcove and counted exits instead of insects. The swarm could overwhelm him if it covered his legs. Fighting every beetle would waste strength he could not replace. Reaching the passage mattered more than wasting strength on a meaningless victory. Seo-jin opened his specimen case and searched the harvested materials for something the scavengers would value more than him. The moss crawler core tissue still carried a strong plant scent beneath the mineral contamination. Carcass Appraisal identified the beetles as scavengers drawn toward dying mana-rich matter. Seo-jin threw one replicated resonance sac across the tunnel. The swarm followed the thrown resonance sac immediately, confirming that the scavengers prioritized dying mana-rich matter over living prey. Hundreds of pale shells shifted away from the alcove. Seo-jin slipped behind the shifting swarm and ran through the opening before the beetles could change direction again. The sacrifice cost him a valuable material. It also taught him another rule the combat classes rarely discussed. Monster resources could control living monsters without becoming a formal taming skill. Knowledge had value before any system multiplied it. The maintenance passage opened onto a broad cavern filled with discarded remains. Old monster bones covered the ground under a thick blanket of mineral dust. Rusted guild tags hung from several skeletons. Seo-jin stopped at the cavern edge because the age and variety of those remains did not match Haeryeong's training records. These corpses had been here far longer than the Academy's current training contract. Some belonged to creatures no longer listed in the dungeon registry. A horned crawler skull lay beside the remains of a winged cave predator. Neither species appeared on Haeryeong's briefing sheet. He stepped carefully between the bones, avoiding mineral pockets that might hide unstable residue or another living scavenger. Carcass appraisal flickered from target to target faster than he could read. Most materials had rotted beyond recovery, but several mineral-sealed remains still carried readable traits under Carcass appraisal. A few had survived because mineral growth sealed them from moisture. Seo-jin opened one mineral pocket with the utility hammer. Inside rested a black tendon wrapped around a pale bone spur. The black tendon still held dormant elasticity despite the years it had spent sealed inside the mineral pocket. The bone spur carried a minor piercing trait. Neither piece had much market value alone, yet their traits complemented the weaknesses of Seo-jin's crude claw knife. Together, they triggered the system's compatibility display. Seo-jin placed them beside his claw knife. The processing interface offered several reinforcement routes using the preserved tendon, bone spur, and damaged claw knife. He chose reinforcement instead of another blade conversion. Bronze light threaded the tendon through the damaged tool handle. The bone spur locked beneath the claw edge. The knife became heavier and more stable. Seo-jin tested the reinforced point against a mineral crust and cracked it with one controlled thrust. A clean fracture spread through the mineral crust, proving the reinforced point could handle material ordinary Academy steel struggled against. His equipment was improving from resources other hunters had abandoned years ago. The cavern's value changed completely once Seo-jin understood what remained there. To Seo-jin was an untouched workshop. He searched only what his remaining time allowed. 2 preserved scale plates became forearm guards under the system's processing function. A strip of hardened crawler membrane became a belt for the overcrowded specimen case. Several dead materials failed compatibility and were left behind. Seo-jin did not force every resource into a weapon. Salvage mattered because the right part served the right purpose. A faint scratching came from beneath the bone field. Seo-jin froze and lowered the claw knife toward the nearest movement beneath the layered remains. One small skull rolled aside near his boot. A dark shape pushed upward through the remains. It was no larger than a house cat. Ash-gray fur clung to a narrow body marked by pale blue stripes. One ear was torn and crusted with old dirt. The creature's golden eyes tracked Seo-jin's hands rather than his face. Carcass appraisal returned an incomplete living target result, instead of the clean material profile Seo-jin expected. The skill could identify pieces of the creature's condition, though several fields remained obscured by unstable mana. The remaining fields appeared only in fragments, giving Seo-jin no reason to lower the knife yet. The remaining appraisal fields identified a weakened juvenile gravelynx with high affinity for corpse-born mana. Seo-jin lowered the claw knife enough to avoid provoking the weakened gravelynx cub. The cub stayed beneath the bones and watched him without making any move to attack. Its ribs showed beneath gray fur, and each shallow breath made the blue stripes along its back dim. The cub ignored Seo-jin's face and sniffed repeatedly toward the mana-rich samples inside his specimen case. The same sensory gland he had replicated from the tunnel hound reacted inside. Seo-jin understood that the starving cub wanted the same concentrated gland the scavenger beetles had followed. He placed one gland on the stone and stepped back. The gravelynx approached in short, guarded movements. It seized the gland and crushed it between small fangs. Mana from the crushed gland spread beneath the cub's ribs and reached the pale blue markings along its back. The cub's breathing steadied after consuming the gland, and blue light returned along the stripes on its back. A bronze system window appeared beside the gravelynx before Seo-jin could decide whether to approach again. Compatible spirit beast candidate detected through profession resource interaction. Nothing in Seo-jin's academy training explained why a spirit beast contract window had appeared beside a wild dungeon creature. The interface offered a resource-based partnership instead of the conventional taming method Seo-jin had never learned. Instead, it displayed a salvage contract based on mutual resource exchange. The wording made Seo-jin read it carefully. The creature would receive compatible monster materials from him. In return, materials gathered through their shared hunts could enter his salvager processing network. The contract treated partnership as resource circulation rather than ownership. That suited him better than forced domination. Seo-jin extended an empty hand and let the gravelynx decide whether to close the distance. The grave lynx watched him for several seconds. Then it crossed the bones and pressed its forehead against his knuckles. Bronze symbols circled Seo-jin's wrist and the cub's forehead once their contact remained unbroken. The system confirmed that Seo-jin and the grave lynx had established a spirit beast contract. The contract notification remained visible while the grave lynx stayed close enough for Seo-jin to feel its dusty fur. The irony was hard to miss. Both partners had survived by finding value among things stronger hunters discarded. The cub sneezed mineral dust onto his sleeve. Seo-jin rubbed it away with his thumb. He named the creature Gurium after the gray cloud color of its fur. Gurium answered by biting the edge of his specimen case. Seo-jin pulled the specimen case away before Gurium could leave another bite mark on the damaged latch. Bones shifted across the cavern floor, when another collapsed tremor rolled through the hidden level. Gurium flattened its ears and turned immediately toward a narrow crack beneath the far wall. The cub pawed once at the narrow opening, then waited for Seo-jin to inspect the airflow coming through it. Warm air poured through the crack strongly enough to stir the dust around Gurium's paws. Seo-jin followed Gurium's attention because the airflow suggested another open route beyond the mineral crust. A low growl vibrated through Gurium's chest. The cub knew something was beyond that wall. Seo-jin checked the emergency crystal attached to his academy badge. Its red light had weakened to a thin pulse. The intervals between the crystal's red pulses had shortened as well, warning that their remaining time was shrinking. He could not spend hours searching for another exit. Gurium approached the crack despite the narrowing time, then stopped long enough to check whether Seo-jin followed. The cub stopped and looked back at him. Seo-jin chose the animal's route and squeezed after it through the opening behind the mineral crust. The gap widened into a sloping tunnel behind the mineral crust. Scraps of old rope had fused into the wall. Someone had once used this route deliberately. Gurium moved quietly ahead while Seo-jin tested each step before committing his weight. The tunnel descended toward the source of the warm air. Red mineral veins thickened beneath their feet as the sloping tunnel carried them closer to the heat source. Several veins pulsed with trapped mana, so Seo-jin collected only a loose shard instead of cutting the living growth. The loose shard came free without disturbing the active vein, giving Seo-jin a sample he could inspect safely. The system marked it as unstable dungeon ore. Its traits included heat storage and delayed release. Seo-jin remembered the mutated burrower absorbing fire magic. The connection was too direct to ignore. Something below had changed the boss through this mineral network. Gurium stopped so abruptly that Seo-jin nearly stepped into the cub before noticing what had caught its attention. The cub scratched twice at a shallow depression beside the tunnel. Seo-jin knelt beside Gurium and brushed dust from the shallow depression the cub had uncovered. A broken hunter bracelet lay beneath the dust with one side crushed and its outer guild mark scratched away. The scratched clasp left no readable guild identity, only enough damage to show someone had removed it deliberately. The bracelet's memory crystal had survived the damage, giving Seo-jin a chance to recover whatever record remained inside. Seo-jin pressed his academy badge against the bracelet reader and waited for the damaged crystal to respond. The damaged crystal produced one archive entry that remained readable despite corruption across most of its stored data. The file contained an old dungeon extermination notice. Most of the extermination notice had corrupted into unreadable blocks, leaving only fragments of the original record. One monster name survived among the damaged lines, clear enough for Seo-jin to read without reconstructing anything. The remaining creature name read Mourning Antler inside the damaged archive record. The record marked the monster as permanently eliminated years earlier. Seo-jin stored the extermination notice in memory and looked down the tunnel where the old territory continued. Gurium's fur had risen along its spine. A heavy scraping sound answered from below, slow enough to belong to something far larger than scavenger beetles. The rhythm was too slow for beetles. Something heavy dragged across stone and stopped. Seo-jin stored the damaged bracelet because even a broken record had already revealed something Haeryeong never mentioned. He did not know whether Mourning Antler had anything to do with the collapse. He did know the old route continued past its recorded territory. If an emergency exit existed below, he had to reach it before the dungeon sealed. Seo-jin moved forward with Gurium beside him. Their first obstacle appeared at the next bend, where two mineral-fed tunnel hounds blocked the narrow passage. Both hounds stood shoulder to shoulder, forcing Seo-jin to break their formation before either could be attacked safely. Both were larger than the wounded hound Seo-jin had killed alone. Red cracks glowed beneath both hounds' jaws, matching the mineral contamination Seo-jin had seen throughout the lower level. Gurium lowered its body close to the floor. Seo-jin held one replicated sensory gland between two fingers. Both hounds smelled the replicated sensory gland immediately and shifted their attention towards Seo-jin's raised hand. He threw the gland past them into the narrow side trench. One hound followed the thrown gland into the side trench exactly as Seo-jin intended. The second hound ignored the bait and kept its attention fixed on Gurium instead. Seo-jin had separated the pair without drawing a blade. Gurium attacked first, darting across the remaining hound's vision before its jaws could lock onto Seo-jin. The cub darted across the hound's vision and forced it to twist. Seo-jin drove the reinforced claw knife into the rear joint exposed by the hound's sudden turn. His reinforced claw knife punched through the soft seam. The hound snapped backward, forcing Seo-jin to release the knife before the twisting body could drag him down. Gurium raked one paw across its muzzle and sprang away. Seo-jin struck the same rear joint again while Gurium kept the hound's attention on its wounded muzzle. The damaged leg folded beneath the hound and sent its shoulder crashing hard into the tunnel wall. The hound crashed shoulder first into the wall. He drove the utility hammer beneath its jaw. The hammer blow beneath its jaw ended the first fight before the second hound returned from the trench. The second hound had already climbed out of the trench. It charged before Seo-jin could recover his stance. Gurium slammed into its front leg from the side. The impact barely hurt the larger beast. It shifted the charge by half a step. That half step of deflection kept the charging hound's teeth from closing around Seo-jin's hip. The hound's teeth closed beside his hip. Seo-jin caught the collar ridge with his scale guard and turned with the momentum. Seo-jin hit the stone hard after redirecting the charge, and the impact drove pain through his bruised shoulder. The reinforced guard cracked but did not break. Gurium climbed onto the hound's back while Seo-jin fought to recover his footing beside the wall. The cub bit behind one ear where the sensory gland sat beneath thin tissue. The hound jerked violently when Gurium bit the thin tissue behind its ear above the sensory gland. Seo-jin recognized the exposed weak point because he had harvested the same gland from another hound earlier. He drove the claw knife into the same point from below. The hound collapsed across Seo-jin's legs after the claw knife pierced the vulnerable tissue beneath its ear. Seo-jin shoved it aside and sat against the wall. Gurium dropped beside him with dust covering its whiskers. For several seconds, Seo-jin and Gurium stayed where they had fallen while the tunnel settled around them. Seo-jin checked Gurium first, parting the dusty fur to make sure the cub had suffered no serious injury. No serious injury appeared beneath the fur. Gurium checked him by biting his sleeve again. Seo-jin pushed Gurium's head away after the cub tested his sleeve with another impatient bite. They had survived their first shared fight. The system recognized both kills as cooperative salvage sources. Seo-jin began harvesting before residual mana faded. The first sensory gland replicated into multiple copies. The second produced reinforced jaw tendons and one mineral heat sac. A stronger bronze flare surrounded the heat sac. Critical replication triggered at a higher grade. Several pristine heat sacs appeared around the original. Echo depth surged with the replicated heat sacs, and the circular indicator changed shape for the first time. The echo det entry separated from the replication log and began forming a distinct indicator beside it. A thin circular mark appeared beside echo det and filled with one dark bronze segment. Seo-jin tried opening the new circular mark, but bronze static still covered every explanation attached to echo det. The system still refused to explain it. Gurium stopped watching the harvested heat sacs and lifted its gaze toward empty space beside Seo-jin's knee. Gurium stared directly at the floating mark, revealing that the spirit beast could perceive Seo-jin's hidden interface. That detail tightened Seo-jin's grip on the harvested heat sac. Standard hunter interfaces were visible only to their registered user unless deliberately shared. Gurium tracked the symbol until it disappeared. The spirit beast contract had connected the cub to more than his salvage inventory. Seo-jin stored the question with the others. Keeping himself alive still came before every unanswered question around the system. He combined one heat sac with the unstable dungeon or shard. The system warned that the materials shared a volatile heat storage trait. Seo-jin selected controlled release instead of maximum output. Bronze lines compressed the sac around the mineral shard. The result became a thumb-sized heat capsule wrapped in tough membrane. Carcass Appraisal identified it as a single-use thermal burst tool. Seo-jin held it away from his face. The Academy had never taught salvagers to make grenades from leftovers. He stored the capsule in an outer pouch where he could reach it quickly. The other replicated heat sacs remained untouched. He had learned enough to respect unstable materials. Gurium sniffed one unstable heat capsule and recoiled hard enough to flatten both ears against its head. Seo-jin returned the capsule to its wrapping, accepting Gurium's reaction as another warning against careless experimentation. They continued down the forgotten route while signs of older battles began appearing along the walls and floor. Broken equipment and old impact marks appeared more often as the route entered another abandoned section of the lower dungeon. Deep gouges crossed the walls above human shoulder height. Several broken spearheads remained embedded in mineral crust. A charred shield boss lay fused to the floor. Seo-jin found no human remains near the abandoned equipment, suggesting the old expedition had recovered its people before withdrawing. Only damaged equipment, stripped field markers, and old drag marks remained around the battlefield. They had also stripped the obvious monster parts. That still left plenty for a salvager. Seo-jin removed hardened resin from beneath an old shell plate. He harvested fibrous muscle preserved inside a sealed leg joint. He collected bone dust carrying a weak mana-conductive trait. Critical replication triggered only once across those materials. The replicated resin doubled his usable supply. Echo depth showed no visible increase after the ordinary resin replication, unlike the stronger critical surges Seo-jin had triggered earlier. Seo-jin compared the resin result with the replicated heat sacs and separated ordinary gains from the darker critical events. Small replication gains left the circular mark unchanged, giving Seo-jin one useful distinction between ordinary and critical results. The strongest multiplications darkened echo det, tying the hidden indicator to the system's most profitable outcomes. That difference mattered more than the growing pile of replicated resources. A system that multiplied resources could become a trap if the debt demanded repayment later. Seo-jin refused to treat free power as truly free. He started separating replicated materials by trigger intensity. Low-grade copies went into the left side of his case. High-grade critical products went into the right. Gurium watched the sorting with open impatience. Seo-jin fed Gurium a strip of mana-rich hound tendon after checking it for mineral contamination. Within moments, blue lines brightened across Gurium's shoulders and the cub's steps became noticeably steadier. A new contract entry opened beside Gurium after the consumed tendon finished circulating through its spirit core. The update added a sensory trait derived directly from the monster material Seo-jin had fed the cub. Grave links could detect concentrated corpse-borne mana through stone at short range. Seo-jin looked at Gurium while the cub was already sniffing along a mineral-covered section of wall. Gurium had gained a tracking trait from the consumed monster material, extending their salvage partnership beyond simple feeding. The new ability gave Gurium a practical role in finding hidden corpse-borne mana before Seo-jin could see its source. That meant monster resources could strengthen his companion without conventional beast training manuals. Seo-jin's progression path widened again because salvaged materials could now strengthen equipment, feed replication, or develop Gurium. Process salvage could become equipment when Seo-jin understood which traits belonged together. Other materials could become disposable tools designed around the specific dangers blocking their route. Compatible monster resources could also strengthen Gurium and unlock traits through their spirit beast contract. His profession was becoming a network instead of a single skill set. The system amplified whatever he understood well enough to use. Seo-jin looked at his battered case with different eyes. He had entered the dungeon carrying tools for cleaning up other people's victories. Now the case held the foundation of his own combat style. A narrow chamber ahead forced them to stop. The floor had split around a deep fissure glowing red from below. Only a broken stone beam connected both sides. Gurium crossed the broken stone beam first, testing the narrow path with quick steps before waiting on the far side. Seo-jin waited until Gurium reached the far side, then tapped the beam twice with a hammer. The beam shifted under Seo-jin's hammer, forcing him to move his heavy specimen case off his back. He removed the heavy specimen case and tied it to mana-resistant thread. Then he crawled across while dragging the case behind him. Halfway over, something moved inside the fissure. A plated head rose through the red glow. It belonged to a young burrower covered in the same mineral growths as the mutated boss. The young burrower struck the beam from below and jolted Seo-jin flat against the unstable stone. A fracture raced beneath Seo-jin's chest and widened toward the far end of the unstable beam. Gurium hissed from the far ledge as another impact widened the fracture beneath Seo-jin. Seo-jin wrapped the thread around his forearm and kicked away from the breaking section. The center section gave way completely, leaving Seo-jin swinging toward the ledge as broken stone fell beneath him. He caught the far ledge with one hand. The sudden load tore through his bruised shoulder when his left hand caught the ledge. Gurium grabbed the thread in its teeth and pulled backward. Gurium pulled the specimen thread backward, preventing the overloaded case from dragging Seo-jin deeper into the fissure. With Gurium holding the case weight back, Seo-jin could use his free hand to search for another grip. Seo-jin drove the claw knife into a stone seam above the ledge. The reinforced claw knife held inside the stone seam long enough for Seo-jin to gain another handhold. Seo-jin hauled himself onto the far side beside Gurium while the young burrower snapped at empty air below. The burrower remained below the ledge, unable to climb the sheer wall after the beam disappeared. Seo-jin rolled onto his back as the last piece of the broken beam disappeared into the red-lit fissure. The red glow swallowed the falling stone until even the sound of its impacts disappeared below. Their route behind them was gone, leaving the carved passage ahead as the only path still available. Gurium pressed against Seo-jin's side while both watched red light pulse upward from the fissure below. The glow pulsed upward in slow intervals that matched the mineral veins running through the corridor walls. Going forward had become the only option again. He stood before his shoulder stiffened further. The passage beyond the fissure had been carved by tools rather than monsters. Old iron brackets lined the carved passage walls, proving human workers had once maintained this forgotten section. Broken lantern hooks appeared at regular intervals. Seo-jin had entered an abandoned expedition corridor. The stone beneath his boots carried faded directional marks. One arrow pointed toward a surface shaft. Another pointed deeper toward a sealed research zone. The surface arrow should have ended his search. The tunnel beneath it had collapsed completely. Massive roots of red mineral fused every gap shut. Seo-jin struck one fused mineral root with the hammer and felt the vibration return through solid stone. The returning vibration showed that the fused root extended deep into the collapsed tunnel, instead of ending near the surface. Breaking through would take longer than the dungeon had left. Gurium moved toward the faded research arrow, after Seo-jin confirmed they could not break through the sealed route quickly enough. Beyond the research arrow, the corridor remained open enough to keep moving before the next structural collapse. Old containment doors appeared farther down the research corridor, their surfaces scarred beneath decades of mineral dust. Several metal doors were bent outward from their frames, showing that something inside had once forced its way into the corridor. Whatever had broken them came from inside. Seo-jin inspected the first door without crossing the threshold. Dried black residue coated the locking mechanism. Carcass appraisal identified monster blood, too degraded for species recognition. The second chamber contained shattered specimen tanks. The third held only rusted chains and broken feeding troughs. Haeryeong's training briefing had mentioned none of this. Seo-jin stopped trusting the dungeon's public history. Someone had used the lower level before the academy classified the gate for students. The erased guild marks on equipment no longer looked accidental. Gurium scratched at a half-open door ahead. Seo-jin pushed it wider with a hammer. A cramped processing room waited behind the corroded door, its shelves still lined with empty specimen jars. Dried labels covered shelves packed with empty specimen jars. One workbench remained intact beneath mineral dust. Seo-jin cleared enough space to set down his case. His forearm guard had cracked during the burrower attack. The claw knife edge had chipped near its base. Gurium's paws were raw from running across mineral stone. Continuing without repairs would turn manageable wounds into serious problems. Seo-jin opened every compartment he still had. Resin, preserved muscle fiber, bone dust, heat sacs, crawler membrane, and replicated glands covered the bench. The system displayed compatibility paths between them. Seo-jin rejected the brightest compatibility routes because the strongest bronze glow had repeatedly accompanied sharp echo det increases. Seo-jin filtered the brightest routes from the display until only the dimmer, more controlled processing options remained. The comparison strengthened his suspicion that bronze intensity tracked the risk attached to echo det. He chose the more stable combinations, using preserved resin and bone dust to rebuild the cracked forearm guard. The repaired forearm guard sealed around the old crack and regained enough rigidity to protect the injured arm. Preserved muscle fiber reinforced the specimen case strap. Crawler membrane wrapped Guryum's front paws in thin protective bands. The cub tried to bite them off. Seo-jin tapped its nose with one finger. Guryum glared at him and kept the wraps. The claw knife needed stronger reinforcement before Seo-jin trusted its chipped edge against another, armored monster. Seo-jin placed one mineral heat sac beside the chipped edge. The compatibility interface offered a controlled thermal tempering method using one mineral heat sac and the damaged blade. Seo-jin selected the lower output version, choosing a repair he could predict over the brighter alternatives. Bronze heat moved along the blade without producing flame. The dark claw edge hardened and developed thin red channels. Carcass Appraisal identified improved penetration against mineralized tissue. Seo-jin had built exactly what the mutated creatures forced him to need. That was the advantage of salvager thinking. Every enemy carried information about the next tool. Every failure could become material if he survived long enough to study it. Seo-jin packed the repaired equipment, treating every failed tool as another source of material instead of useless loss. A metal drawer beneath the workbench refused to open. Seo-jin nearly abandoned the jammed drawer until Guryum began pawing at one corner with unusual persistence. Guryum's claws clicked differently against the lower corner, where the metal had thinned around a concealed seam. The drawer carried the same corpse-borne mana scent the cub had learned to detect. Seo-jin cut through the rusted latch after Guryum's new tracking trait detected concentrated corpse-borne mana inside. Inside lay a sealed monster egg no larger than his palm. Its shell had turned gray with age. Carcass Appraisal marked the embryo as dead. Guryum sniffed the shell and backed away. The system responded to the sealed egg with a different interface from ordinary monster materials. It classified the egg as dormant spirit material compatible with salvage conversion and critical replication. A second line warned that converting the dormant material could produce spirit fragments instead of physical copies. Seo-jin hesitated because the bronze flare around the option was stronger than any replication since the system awakened. Seo-jin checked Echo Det before touching the confirmation field for the dormant spirit conversion. Echo Det already carried one dark segment. Using the conversion could push it further. He studied the dead egg instead of accepting immediately. The shell contained preserved spiritual residue despite the failed embryo. Guryum's contract window reacted to that residue. The material could strengthen the cub's spirit core. Seo-jin looked toward the damaged corridor outside. A living companion mattered more than a safe inventory. Seo-jin activated the conversion only after deciding Guryum's survival mattered more than preserving a rare specimen. Bronze light swallowed the dead egg and split its gray shell into several translucent spirit fragments. Instead of producing duplicate eggs, the conversion left pale fragments rotating above the broken shell. Guryum crouched low as the fragments circled its body. Blue stripes along the cub's fur burned brighter. The fragments hovered around Guryum's chest before sinking through the blue stripes along its fur. Guryum's shadow stretched across the floor as the fragments entered its chest one after another. For an instant, the shadow showed a larger feline shape with antler-like ears. Then the image collapsed back into the small cub. The enlarged shadow collapsed back into the cub when the system confirmed that Guryum's spirit core had stabilized. The contract interface showed an advanced salvage synergy after the final spirit fragment disappeared into Guryum. Echo Det rose sharply at the same moment, filling a second dark segment inside the circular mark. The new segment remained visible after the spirit conversion ended, proving the increase had become permanent. Seo-jin's vision blurred around the edges as the completed segment sent a cold pulse through the bronze interface. A whisper passed through his head in a voice he could not recognize. The distorted voice sharpened for an instant, turning the whisper into something close to a command. The command that reached Seo-jin clearly through the distortion was a single word: return. Seo-jin gripped the workbench until the blurred edges of the room sharpened again. Gurium pressed against his shin and stared upward. Gurium had heard the same whisper, judging from the way the cub stared toward the empty air above Seo-jin. Seo-jin opened the interface immediately, searching Echo Det for any new field connected to the voice. Echo Det offered no explanation for the voice. The two dark segments remained inside the circular mark. His pulse slowed only after the bronze mark stopped changing, and the whisper failed to return. He closed the interface and crouched beside Gurium. The cub's spirit core felt warmer beneath his palm. Its breathing had deepened without becoming strained. The spirit fragments had strengthened Gurium, though the second dark segment made the price impossible to dismiss. It had also made the hidden debt feel much less abstract. Seo-jin would not trigger another major replication unless survival demanded it. That decision lasted until the corridor shook again. The first heavy impact came from beyond the containment rooms and rattled the jars on the processing shelves. Dust burst from the processing room doorframe and several empty jars rattled off the nearest shelf. A second impact followed from farther away. Something was moving through the lower research zone. Gurium turned toward the distant impacts, and the new spirit core glowed blue beneath the fur along its chest. The blue glow concentrated around Gurium's chest and pulsed toward the distant movement beyond the corridor. Seo-jin gathered the equipment from the bench. He left the room before another collapse could trap them inside. The lower corridor divided near a broken observation station. One branch sloped upward toward old ventilation shafts. The other descended toward a sealed chamber marked with faded hazard bands. Warm air rose from the hazard-marked lower branch, carrying the same mineral scent as the research chambers. Fresh cold air descended from the upper branch, giving Seo-jin the first sign of a possible surface route. Seo-jin chose the upward branch because reaching an exit still mattered more than exploring another sealed chamber. Seo-jin marked the hazard branch mentally before turning toward the colder air above. Gurium followed close behind as the corridor narrowed into an old ventilation route. A rusted service ladder climbed through the shaft, disappearing into darkness broken only by thin strips of cold air. Several ladder rungs had rusted through, forcing Seo-jin to climb with most of his weight on one arm. Each missing rung forced Seo-jin to shift more weight onto his good arm while climbing. Gurium moved through side braces beside him. They rose until darkness ended against a slab of collapsed concrete. Seo-jin pushed against the collapsed slab above the shaft and found it wedged tightly beneath fused mineral growth. The slab refused to move, so Seo-jin searched its edges with the reinforced claw knife. The claw knife found mineral packed into every edge, leaving no opening wide enough to pry apart. Red mineral roots had sealed the shaft from above. The fresh air entered through cracks too narrow for either of them. Seo-jin lowered his forehead against the cold metal ladder. A strip of fresh air leaked around the collapsed slab, proving open space existed somewhere directly above it. The nearest escape route sat less than an arm's length above Seo-jin, blocked by mineral he could barely cut. Gurium scratched one exposed root beside the slab, and blue light spread from the cub's wrapped paw. The mineral beneath Gurium's wrapped paw dimmed as the blue glow passed into the fused root. The cub's claws cut a shallow groove into the surface. Seo-jin examined the shallow groove Gurium had cut and found the mineral surface weaker around the drained section. The strengthened spirit core had sharpened Gurium's corpse mana trait into something more active. The root around the groove had lost color. Gurium was draining residual monster energy from the fused mineral. Gurium's corpse mana trait could weaken the fused mineral, giving them a method even if the process remained too slow. It could not clear the entire shaft quickly enough. Seo-jin looked at the unstable heat capsules in his pouch. A direct blast might open the route. It might also bring the entire ceiling down on them. He returned the capsule to the pouch. The exit needed controlled force they did not have yet. Seo-jin climbed back down after marking the blocked shaft on the damaged bracelet map for a possible return. After marking the route, Seo-jin and Gurium descended toward the junction and the unopened hazard branch. If he found a stronger cutting resource below, they could return. The choice forced them toward the hazard-marked chamber. Its containment door had not been broken outward. Someone had welded it shut from the corridor side. Seo-jin found the old locking wheel half buried in mineral dust. The metal resisted until he wrapped crawler membrane around the grip. The wheel turned with a long metallic groan. Gurium backed away from the widening seam. Cold gray vapor escaped through the widening door seam and rolled around Seo-jin's boots before the chamber became visible. The chamber beyond contained no living monster. Rows of empty restraints surrounded a central examination platform. Deep scratches covered the central examination platform, crossing older antler-shaped impressions carved into the surrounding stone. Several impressions matched the spread of antlers large enough to reach beyond the central examination platform. Seo-jin approached the nearest antler mark slowly, and Carcass Appraisal reacted before his glove touched the surface. Pale appraisal markers gathered along the carved groove before Seo-jin made physical contact. Carcass Appraisal identified the mark as Mourning Antler residue from the sealed research period. The same creature named in the old extermination notice had been held inside this room. Seo-jin studied the broken restraints around the room, trying to reconcile them with the old extermination notice. The record said the monster died years ago. The room suggested someone kept studying it before that death. A cracked archive crystal remained inside the observation console. Seo-jin connected his academy badge to the cracked archive crystal inside the observation console. Most files opened as corrupted fragments, but one damaged timeline retained enough structure to read. One timeline opened far enough to read. The research team had attempted to preserve useful monster traits after death. They harvested residual cores, fused them with dungeon minerals, and tested whether those traits could be stored. Seo-jin's eyes moved toward the red veins crossing the chamber walls. The same research had spread through the lower dungeon. The mineral network was carrying preserved monster traits into living creatures. That explained the training boss's mutated armor. It did not explain why the network was active now. The final readable file contained an emergency shutdown order. Mourning Antler had died during containment failure. The same final file ended with an emergency order to seal the entire research zone afterward. Seo-jin read the damage date marker twice. The event happened long before Haeryeong Academy began using the dungeon for trainees. Someone had known this lower level existed. Someone had still approved student access above it. A sharp crack sounded behind the examination platform before any new movement appeared in the mist. Gurium arched its back and fixed its attention on the wall behind the examination platform. One antler-shaped groove in the wall had begun glowing. The glow spread through every carved impression around the platform. Red mineral veins answered beneath the floor. Seo-jin pulled Gurium away from the center. The examination platform split down the middle. Black mist poured from the splitting examination platform and spread low across the floor around Seo-jin's boots. The mist smelled of wet soil, old iron, and burned resin. Carcass Appraisal filled his vision with corrupted symbols. The skill could not decide whether the substance was alive or dead. Seo-jin backed toward the containment door, while the black mist continued spreading around the platform. The welded frame slammed shut behind him. The locking wheel spun on its own. The sealed wheel locked with a metallic snap, cutting off the only corridor they had used to enter. Gurium snarled toward the broken platform once the chamber entrance locked behind them. Something large shifted beneath the black mist, pushing the vapor outward in slow waves across the floor. A bone-white antler rose through the mist first, its surface scarred by old mineral deposits. A second antler followed from the opposite side, spreading wider than the examination platform beneath it. A long skull emerged between the antlers, followed by a body wrapped in scarred muscle and mineral growth. Dark hide stretched over the creature's mineral-bound frame, with old scar tissue visible between the plated growths. The creature climbed from beneath the platform without making a normal breathing sound. Red veins pulsed inside its empty-looking chest. Seo-jin recognized the silhouette from the archive fragments. Mourning Antler stood in front of him. The dungeon record had declared it dead years earlier. Mourning Antler lowered its head towards Seo-jin, dragging both antlers close enough to scrape the chamber ceiling. Its antlers scraped the ceiling and shed pale mineral dust. Gurium moved between Seo-jin and the creature. Seo-jin caught the cub by the shoulder before it charged. Mourning Antler held its ground instead of attacking, then turned directly toward the bronze fragment beneath Seo-jin's uniform. Mourning Antler ignored Gurium completely and kept its empty gaze fixed on Seo-jin's chest. The activation anchor had become warm against his chest. Echo Det opened across Seo-jin's vision on its own as the activation anchor continued heating beneath his uniform. Both completed dark segments glowed in response to Mourning Antler, brighter than during any previous replication event. Mourning Antler's empty sockets brightened with the same bronze color. Seo-jin's mouth dried and his grip tightened when Mourning Antler kept staring directly at the hidden anchor. The system and this dead monster shared something he had never been told. The creature stepped forward and crushed the examination platform edge beneath one front hoof. The broken platform edge collapsed further beneath Mourning Antler's weight and exposed red mineral veins below. The impact broke the moment of hesitation. Seo-jin threw a heat capsule toward the far wall. The heat capsule burst against the far wall, releasing its stored energy through the red mineral veins. The connected veins carried the thermal flare beneath the platform and into Mourning Antler's mineral-bound legs. Mourning Antler turned toward the sudden flare, giving Seo-jin enough time to pull Gurium toward the opposite side. Seo-jin dragged Gurium behind the opposite side of the platform while the boss tracked the heat flare. The distraction bought them only a few steps. The monster's antler struck the floor behind them. Stone fragments tore across Seo-jin's repaired forearm guard. Seo-jin used the impact to roll behind the observation console before the next antler sweep reached him. Gurium landed beside Seo-jin while Mourning Antler dragged one antler free from the broken wall. Mourning Antler's movement tore open the damaged floor and exposed black tissue beneath its left foreleg. The exposed black seam flexed beneath the mineral shell whenever Mourning Antler shifted weight onto that leg. Seo-jin used Carcass Appraisal on the exposed seam. Carcass Appraisal returned a partial reading on the exposed seam beneath Mourning Antler's mineral shell. Preserved corpse tissue had been reinforced by heat-storing mineral. Several joints remained vulnerable where the original body had decayed before fusion. Seo-jin finally had a target, several joints where the original corpse had decayed before mineral reinforcement formed. He signaled Gurium toward the creature's left side. The cub moved without needing spoken instruction. Mourning Antler followed the blue glow of Gurium's stripes. Seo-jin circled right with the claw knife low. The creature swung its antlers across the chamber. Gurium ducked beneath one sweeping antler branch and cut across the monster's left side. Seo-jin dropped flat as another passed over his shoulder. He came up beside the weakened front joint. The claw knife struck the black seam. The reinforced claw knife entered halfway into the black seam before Mourning Antler reacted. Mourning Antler kicked backward the instant the blade bit into the decayed joint beneath its foreleg. Seo-jin released the knife and took the hoof across his forearm guard. The impact threw him into the console. The observation console buckled under Seo-jin's back and knocked the remaining air from his lungs. His repaired guard split along the old crack. Gurium attacked the embedded knife instead of the armored body, striking the exposed handle with both front paws. The second impact on the knife handle drove the blade farther inward as Mourning Antler tried to regain balance. The claw knife drove deeper under Gurium's weight and split more of the weakened tissue around the joint. Mourning Antler lurched sideways when the damaged foreleg could no longer support its full weight. With its front end dipping, Mourning Antler had to widen its stance and expose more of the opposite side. Seo-jin pushed himself away from the bent console despite the pain running through his forearm. His fingers still closed despite the pain, giving Seo-jin enough control to reach for another weapon. He grabbed the utility hammer because the claw knife remained buried inside Mourning Antler's damaged joint. Mourning Antler turned back towards Seo-jin as bronze light began leaking through cracks along its skull. The glowing cracks widened across Mourning Antler's skull as black mist gathered between its open jaws. The creature opened its mouth and drew the black mist around its jaw inward. No roar followed. The gathered corpse-born man erupted outward as a crushing pressure wave. Loose tools and broken restraints lifted from the floor before the pressure wave reached Seo-jin and Gurium. Gurium skidded across the floor under the pressure while Seo-jin dropped behind the broken platform edge. Seo-jin stayed low behind the platform as fragments and black mist swept over the broken edge. Every loose specimen jar shattered against the walls as the pressure wave crossed the room. Spinning glass filled the black mist and struck the floor around the broken examination platform. Part of the corpse-borne pressure vanished into Gurium's contract mark before it could reach Seo-jin. Blue light flared around Gurium as the spirit core absorbed part of the corpse-born mana through their contract. The rest struck Seo-jin through the floor. Seo-jin's vision darkened briefly when the remaining pressure traveled through the floor and struck his body. Echo depth surged across his interface at the same moment, expanding toward a third dark segment. The two dark segments expanded into a third incomplete section. Seo-jin had triggered no replication, yet Echo Det was rising from direct contact with Mourning Antler. The Det was reacting to Mourning Antler directly. That reaction changed the meaning of the fight, because Echo Det clearly tracked more than replicated resources. Killing the creature might reveal what Echo Det actually tracked. Failing would bury that answer with him. Seo-jin rose behind the broken platform with the hammer ready as Mourning Antler gathered itself for another charge. Mourning Antler charged through the black mist. Seo-jin waited until the antlers filled his vision. Then he crushed the remaining heat capsule beneath the utility hammer. Stored heat burst across the floor instead of the wall. The red mineral veins beneath Mourning Antler ignited together. The monster's own armor absorbed the thermal surge. That was exactly the reaction Seo-jin wanted, because the armor was now carrying more stored heat than before. He wanted every glowing channel saturated until the shell could no longer distribute the stored heat safely. Every glowing channel across the creature's legs expanded under the sudden load. Gurium struck the weakened front joint again. The overloaded mineral shell cracked around the embedded claw knife. Mourning Antler stumbled through the broken platform. Seo-jin closed the distance before Mourning Antler could recover its balance on the damaged foreleg. He brought the utility hammer down on the embedded claw knife and drove it deeper into the weakened joint. The first hammer strike drove the blade deeper while survival remained Seo-jin's only priority. The second strike forced every remaining ounce of strength into the same damaged joint. The buried claw knife finally punched through the decayed joint core under the force of Seo-jin's hammer. Mourning Antler's front leg collapsed after the blade punched through the decayed core beneath its joint. Its antlers carved a deep trench across the floor. Seo-jin jumped aside and lost the hammer from his hand. Mourning Antler turned while still kneeling, dragging one antler across the floor toward Seo-jin. One antler caught the strap of his specimen case. The reinforced strap tore away from Seo-jin's specimen case and spilled its contents across the chamber. Replicated glands, membranes, resin, and spare heat sacs scattered across the chamber. Seo-jin watched several valuable materials disappear into cracks. Seo-jin abandoned the scattered materials immediately because chasing them would put his back toward Mourning Antler. The living threat mattered more than the inventory. Mourning Antler lowered its skull for another pressure wave. Gurium leaped onto the broken antler base near its neck. Blue light spread from the cub's claws into the monster's corpse-born tissue. The forming pressure wave faltered as Gurium drained corpse-born mana through the monster's damaged neck. Gurium was draining the preserved mana holding the dead flesh together. Mourning Antler thrashed violently, smashing its skull against the nearby wall in an attempt to throw Gurium loose. Seo-jin sprinted toward the fallen hammer while the boss's attention remained fixed on the cub. The monster slammed its neck into the wall. Gurium lost its grip and hit the floor. Gurium tried to rise after hitting the floor, but the cub's rear leg shook under its weight. One rear leg buckled completely, leaving Gurium exposed beside Mourning Antler's descending hoof. Seo-jin abandoned the hammer and changed direction the instant he saw Gurium fall. He reached Gurium before the next hoof came down. Seo-jin pulled the cub across the floor by its protective wraps. The hoof crushed stone where Gurium had been. Dust covered Seo-jin and Gurium after the hoof shattered stone where the cub had been lying. Gurium's injured leg trembled when it tried to stand. Seo-jin placed himself between the cub and Mourning Antler. The utility hammer remained several steps away. His claw knife was still buried inside the monster's ruined joint. His specimen case lay open across the chamber. Seo-jin had one broken forearm guard and a handful of scattered materials. A broken guard and scattered monster materials looked worthless to anyone except a salvager who understood their remaining traits. He grabbed the split guard from his arm. Bone dust and resin still clung inside the repaired seam. Seo-jin pressed a spare heat sac against the broken plate. The system offered an emergency combination using the split forearm plate, preserved resin, and the spare heat sac. Its bronze glow was stronger than every safe route he had rejected earlier. Echo-det pulsed beside the high-output option, warning Seo-jin that the emergency craft would carry another hidden cost. Seo-jin looked once at Gurium's shaking rear leg. Seo-jin accepted the combination after one glance at Gurium's trembling rear leg and Mourning Antler's approaching shadow. Critical replication triggered through the emergency craft. The broken guard divided into several overlapping mineral plates around the heat sac. They fused into a short, hooked cleaver shaped by the original shell fragments. Red channels ran across its dark edge. Echo-det completed its third dark segment as the emergency cleaver finished forming in Seo-jin's hand. The unknown whisper returned immediately, clearer than the single word Seo-jin had heard after Gurium's evolution. This time it carried more than one word. The whisper warned Seo-jin to return before the det remembered who he was. Seo-jin's vision twisted when the warning ended, and an unfamiliar scene forced itself across his sight. A scene flashed behind his eyes that did not belong to him. Bronze doors stood beneath a black sky. Something with countless antlers waited beyond them. The image vanished before he could understand it. Mourning Antler charged before Seo-jin could make sense of the bronze doors or the antlered silhouette behind them. Seo-jin raised the hooked cleaver and angled its reinforced edge toward the nearest branch of the charging antler. The improvised weapon caught one antler branch and slid along its mineral surface. Red channels in the blade drank the stored heat. The weapon grew brighter with every inch. Seo-jin twisted his shoulders and redirected the antler branch past his ribs instead of trying to stop the charge. Seo-jin's boots carved two lines through the dust as he forced the antler past his body. Mourning Antler's shoulders dipped when its damaged stance could no longer carry the redirected momentum. Mourning Antler's weakened leg failed under the redirected weight and dropped its skull within striking distance. Seo-jin swung the heated cleaver into the cracked jaw seam. The mineral shell burst apart in dry fragments. Black vapor leaked from the exposed corpse tissue. Gurium forced itself upright on three stable legs and lunged toward the exposed corpse tissue beneath the jaw. The cub bit into the vapor-dark seam and pulled. Blue light gathered between Gurium's teeth as the cub pulled preserved mana out of the exposed tissue. Mourning Antler convulsed when Gurium tore a strand of preserved mana from the exposed seam. Seo-jin struck the same jaw seam again before the boss could pull its skull away. The heated hook buried deeper and split the mineral shell far enough for Carcass Appraisal to read beneath it. The system highlighted a core beneath the throat. Carcass Appraisal had finally mapped enough of the monster to expose its true salvage point. Seo-jin released the cleaver and reached for the embedded claw knife near the front leg. He tore it free with both hands. Mourning Antler twisted toward Seo-jin as he tore the claw knife free from its ruined foreleg. Gurium bit deeper into Mourning Antler's neck seam and tore loose another strand of corpse-born mana. The boss slowed when Gurium pulled another strand of corpse mana from its neck, creating one narrow opening. Seo-jin drove the claw knife beneath the throat. The reinforced point pierced the highlighted core. Bronze light burst through every crack in Mourning Antler's body the instant the claw knife pierced its core. Mourning Antler froze with its antlers inches from Seo-jin. The red veins inside its body went dark one by one. The creature collapsed onto the broken platform. Seo-jin rolled away before its weight trapped him. Gurium limped toward Seo-jin after the boss collapsed, keeping its injured rear leg raised from the floor. The chamber stopped shaking for several seconds. Seo-jin remained on one knee and watched the corpse. Carcass Appraisal confirmed the core had failed. Only after that confirmation did the system register Mourning Antler as defeated and close the combat notification. The monster recorded as dead years earlier had now died a second time in front of Seo-jin. Seo-jin ignored the system window at first and reached for Gurium's injured rear leg. The cub's rear leg carried a deep bruise but no broken bone. He wrapped it with the remaining crawler membrane. Gurium leaned against his wrist during the treatment. Only after securing the wrap did Seo-jin approach the corpse. Mourning Antler's corpse began breaking apart before Seo-jin finished approaching the ruined examination platform. Black mist escaped through every crack in the mineral shell. Residual mana drained from the corpse so quickly that every salvage marker began losing stability. Seo-jin had very little time to salvage anything. Carcass Appraisal flooded his vision with material markers. Preserved antler marrow appeared among the first valuable markers across the collapsing corpse. Heat-storing shell plates followed, each one already losing stability as the body broke apart. Corpse mana tendon remained usable for only a short window before its residual energy dispersed. Carcass Appraisal also marked an unknown bronze core fragment buried behind Mourning Antler's throat. Seo-jin ignored the market value of everything else. He cut toward the bronze fragment first. The claw knife chipped again against mineralized tissue. Gurium bit into the softened seam and pulled it wider. Seo-jin reached through the open seam with gloved fingers and followed the bronze marker behind the throat. He extracted a thin bronze shard matching the chest fragment almost exactly. The Critical Replication System reacted the moment Seo-jin pulled the bronze shard free from Mourning Antler. The interface classified the shard as a high-grade salvage source carrying archive system authority. Critical replication probability rose beyond every previous trigger. Echo Det flashed across Seo-jin's vision while the 3 completed segments began moving around the circular mark. The 3 completed dark segments rotated faster as bronze static spread across the rest of Seo-jin's interface. Seo-jin pulled his hand away from the confirmation field when the high-grade replication prompt appeared. The replication activated by itself before Seo-jin could reject or confirm the high-grade source. Bronze light swallowed the shard and spread across the corpse in thin branching lines. The single bronze fragment multiplied into several copies, each carrying the same closed-eye mark. The new copies never entered Seo-jin's inventory or settled on the corpse beside the original. The copied fragments folded inward and merged with the bronze activation anchor beneath Seo-jin's uniform. The bronze scale against his chest grew warm enough to sting. A new system entry appeared after the copied fragments finished merging into Seo-jin's bronze activation anchor. The interface recognized the fragment as an archived source connected to the same authority as the bronze chest. Another line stated that partial authority had been restored through the recovered archive fragment. Echo depth shifted into an unexplained collection state as the 3rd dark segment began rotating around the circular mark. Seo-jin stepped backward because the system had changed without asking for any command from him. The words carried no timer and no explanation. Gurium growled toward Mourning Antler's collapsing corpse before Seo-jin could study the new system state. Seo-jin turned from the interface and saw the dead monster's skull beginning to lift. Mourning Antler's corpse moved again, even though Carcass Appraisal had already confirmed its core was destroyed. The broken core remained dark inside the body, leaving no normal source for the renewed movement. The monster could no longer stand, yet its skull continued rising from the shattered platform. Its skull lifted from the platform anyway. Empty sockets followed Seo-jin across the chamber. Bronze light gathered inside Mourning Antler's empty sockets and fixed directly on Seo-jin. Seo-jin raised the chipped claw knife while keeping himself between the moving corpse and Gurium. Gurium crouched beside him on 3 steady legs, despite the fresh wrap around its injured rear limb. Mourning Antler made no attempt to attack, even after the knife came up between them. Its broken jaw opened slowly, grinding mineral fragments across teeth that should never have moved again. A human voice emerged from the dead creature. The sound was rough and distant, carried through damaged tissue that should no longer function. Seo-jin tightened his grip on the knife as the impossible voice scraped through the ruined throat. The dead jaw shaped one clear syllable through the rough, distorted voice. That syllable was Kang, the family name Seo-jin had never given anyone inside this dungeon. His fingers tightened until the damaged knife grip pressed hard against his palm. Mourning Antler tilted its skull toward the bronze activation fragment hidden beneath Seo-jin's uniform. The ruined mouth moved once more, forcing another word through the collapsing corpse. This time it formed Seo-jin, completing his name with impossible familiarity. No Academy record connected his name to this dungeon. He had never entered gate before today. The research zone had been sealed years before he awakened as a hunter. Yet a monster officially dead for years knew exactly who stood before it. Seo-jin took one step closer despite every instinct telling him to leave. The bronze light inside the corpse flickered. Mourning Antler tried to speak again as the bronze light inside its sockets began flickering. Only broken sounds escaped this time, too damaged for Seo-jin to recover another word. The black mist around its body thickened. Seo-jin activated Carcass Appraisal one more time. The skill no longer identified Mourning Antler as a normal monster corpse. A corrupted category replaced the normal corpse classification when Carcass Appraisal finished its second scan. The corrupted category identified the body only as echo-bearing remains. Seo-jin's entire interface shook when the circular echo det mark opened at its center. The opened echo det mark revealed a dark center deeper than any ordinary interface window should contain. For an instant, the bronze doors from his vision appeared inside that darkness. Mourning Antler dragged one antler across the stone. The movement pointed toward a sealed section beneath the examination platform. Haeryeong stared toward the same sealed section beneath the platform that Mourning Antler had indicated with its antler. Seo-jin followed the line with his eyes. A symbol had been carved beneath the broken platform. It matched the closed eye mark from the bronze chest. The corpse crumbled before Seo-jin could examine anything else. The last mineral fragments lost their shape and scattered across the platform as fine gray dust. The remaining black mist sank through cracks in the floor. Mourning Antler disappeared for the second time in recorded history. The dungeon tremors returned the instant Mourning Antler disappeared, shaking loose debris from the sealed research chamber. Seo-jin lifted Haeryeong against his chest and gathered only the materials within reach. The hidden research zone was collapsing around them, but one fact had changed everything. The bronze chest had awakened Seo-jin's system, yet Mourning Antler carried a fragment of the same hidden authority. Echo Det was tied to something buried in Haeryeong's forgotten research zone long before Seo-jin entered the dungeon. Whatever memory survived inside that buried network had recognized him without any academy record or prior visit. Kang Seo-jin survived the dungeon, but something beneath Haeryeong already knew exactly who he was.